Okay, here we go. So what was going on last week in chapter 12?
Mary Magdalene put the really, really expensive jar of nard that's worth, like we figured, I don't know, a whole year's wages, $20,000 some dollars, and probably her whole savings in this great act of love, like a complete sacrifice, and a love that is just beyond all like comprehension for Jesus, and wiped her hair with him and put it on his feet and wiped her hair with his feet with her hair. And then Judas complained and grumbled and said, why do we do this? This should go to the poor, the whole wages. And just like because he doesn't really care that much about Jesus, and he is all about the money bags. And so we saw his criminal kind of character, and Jesus said, the poor will always be with you, but I will not always be with you. And it was also a foreshadow of his burial and
Yeah. And all of that is happening, of course, at a dinner where Lazarus is sitting, because he's just been raised from the dead. So here's Mary having seen her brother come back from the dead, and they're honoring Jesus. But all of this, of course, is looking ahead to the death of Jesus himself. Okay, and then he came into Jerusalem. How did that go?
It's called the Triumphal Entry.
Now, before that, the Jews wanted to kill Lazarus.
Yeah.
Is that where you're going?
Yeah, well, yeah, that too. So all of that. So they want to kill. Well, news keeps getting around, right? That Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, and everybody's getting all worked up about that, and they want to go see Jesus. And so the Jews are like, okay, not only are we going to kill Jesus, we're going to kill Lazarus again, which just doesn't make any sense, but there it is. Yeah. So they are very much, the opposition to Jesus from the religious leaders just keeps ratcheting up. Okay, and then how was the triumphal entry? Yeah, it's so triumphal. Okay, so we talked about what were they expecting from a Messiah, from the King of Israel, do you think?
We're expecting something, soldiers and a big triumphant parade.
Mm-hmm.
Big white horse.
Yep.
Horse.
Yep. And Jesus,
Armor and
and Jesus knows that's what they're looking for, and he intentionally does the opposite. He comes in this public entrance, but he does it on a little donkey. Not only to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament about how the king would come, but also just to show he's not that king. He's come in gentleness and peace and humility, because his agenda is just totally different from theirs.
You thought the disciples would have started to get the message about what was going to happen. They'd been with him for 3 years, and if he was going to be the earthly king, he certainly would have been amassing some kind of a following that would be more militaristic than all the crowds that came with him to him with their sick and all that. And that's what he did, was heal their sick and feed them. But he certainly didn't make any motions like he was going to be a military king.
No.
But they didn't catch on to that either.
No, because they're still, not in John, but we know from the other Gospels that they're still at this point saying, okay, so when you come into your glory, we would like the positions of honor on your right and left, right? Because they're not expecting the positions on the right and left are going to be crosses. They're expecting the positions on right and left are going to be like, the places at a banquet table. And Jesus is like, you have no idea what you're asking, because you don't know what's coming. Okay, so let's look at, what was the last thing that the Pharisees said? Actually, never mind, I'm just going to read that bit, and then we'll talk about it. So, John chapter 12, and I'm going to start back in verse 17, which we covered last week, but it flows into what's coming next. So, John 12, 17 to 36. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had given this miraculous sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. "Sir," they said, "we would like to see Jesus." Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The man who loves his life will lose it, while the man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Now my heart is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven, "I have glorified it and will glorify it again." The crowd that was there and heard it said it thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. Jesus said, "This voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. The crowd spoke up. "We have heard from the law that the Christ will remain forever, so how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man?" Then Jesus told them, "You are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. The man who walks in the dark does not know where he is going. Put your trust in the light while you have it, so that you may become sons of light." When he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them. Okay, so what was it that the Pharisees said in that last bit that we looked at last week?
Look, everyone goes after him, the
Yeah,
whole world.
the whole world. And you know they're just exaggerating to make a point like, he's got this huge following and we need to put a stop to that. But what's really interesting is what happens in the very next verse, in verse 20. Because who shows up? The Gentiles, yep, the Greeks. So there are these Greeks who suddenly come into the picture, and in contrast to the Sanhedrin and the religious leaders who are trying to kill Jesus, what do these Gentiles want?
They want to meet him.
Yeah, there's just this really stark contrast, which I think John intends for us to see. Even now, the Gentiles want to know who Jesus is, while the Jews are plotting how they're going to execute their Messiah. But the Pharisees were right. The whole world is going to him, and that's just getting started. You know, we know what's coming after the resurrection, that the whole world really is going to go to him. Okay, so these Greeks, these Gentiles enter the scene, and they've come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish Passover. And so, I mean, in the Old Testament law, people who converted and went through the ritual purification that was required for the Passover could come and participate. And so there are these Gentiles who are coming for Passover, and they want to talk to Jesus. So they go to Philip, who John tells us again is from Bethsaida in Galilee. I don't know why he mentions that. Maybe it's because Philip's hometown is in an area we know on the north part of the Sea of Galilee that was actually really close to the Gentile region around the Decapolis and places where we know from the other Gospels Jesus had done ministry. So it might be that they've just found the guy who's closest to where they live. They know, maybe they know who he is, or they know where his hometown is. I don't know. But at any rate, they go and find Philip, and Philip goes and tells Andrew, and then the two of them go and tell Jesus. Now, we're not told why they want to see him, but it's not hard to think of some possible reasons. First, this triumphal entry, there's all this excitement. So, whoever this guy is, he must be important. Maybe they've heard about raising Lazarus from the dead. Maybe they want to talk to him because they know about the miracles that he's been doing. Maybe they saw some of the things that he did when he was in the Gentile regions during his ministry. Or we know from the other Gospels that during this week, Jesus does another cleansing at the temple, and he specifically cleans out the court of the Gentiles. So it might be that there are Gentiles there who see him do that and are like, I want to talk to that guy. I don't know. But whatever the case, they know Jesus he's somebody they want to meet. So Philip and Andrew go and tell Jesus. Now, how does Jesus respond to that?
The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified.
He changes the subject entirely. That kind of disappoints me, because I wanted to hear what the Greeks were going to say and what he was going to answer. We don't know from the text whether or not they actually met with him or not. Maybe they did, but it's just not recorded here. But the way that John narrates it is important because it points to the priority of Jesus' mission and the timing of the Father's plan. Now, when he says the hour has come, ever since chapter 2, ever since the wedding feast at Cana. That's the first time we heard this mention of his hour. And it kept saying over and over and over, his hour has not come, his hour has not come. And now here's Jesus saying the hour has come. The hour for what? I know you know this, but the hour is the crucifixion. But what does he say about that hour in 22, in 23?
The Son of Man should be glorified.
Now that's interesting. How do you put crucifixion and glorification together in the same hour? Well, what do you think? What? How is this crucifixion going to bring glory to the Son and to the Father both?
Because the crucifixion isn't the end of the story.
Uh-huh.
It's the resurrection that follows it.
And it's also what it accomplishes for the sins of the world. That he, in his blood, in his death, that's why we drink the cup. And that then we proclaim that his death every time, and through his blood and through his body, that as it through death are our sins forgiven, and we have peace with God.
Yeah, and all of that gives us a clearer revelation of who God is. Like we see the character of our God in living color when he actually dies for us. So all over the Old Testament, we get descriptions about who God is. We get descriptions about his love and his mercy and his forgiveness, his care for his people. But that description suddenly takes on a whole new meaning when God himself becomes a human being and dies in our place. And there is glory in the fact that that reveals, the crucifixion reveals his character in a very personal way for us. And then that he walks out of his own grave. Like all of that, think about how much shame the people who see this are going to associate with it when they see the Messiah get crucified. But Jesus has been saying all along, this is not ultimately for his shame, it's ultimately for the glory of God. But you have to know the bigger picture to know how it is that God's going to be glorified by the terrible humiliation and degradation of his son.
And even with the world growing dark, the world turning dark at that point, and 3 days later, the light is revealed. So it's kind of interesting to me that it still takes time. He's still working in that period of time.
Yeah. I read a quote from somebody who said about the crucifixion, he said, "Here is a glory no other God would want. Other gods want service and they want sustenance, but our God needs nothing. Because he has life in himself, he is brimming over with it and he pours it out for us." Well, yeah, you don't see any other God in any other religion becoming a human being and dying for his people. And it is to his glory that he does that. Yeah. So the Son of Man will be glorified in this hour of the crucifixion. Now, it's so interesting to me that this is Jesus' answer to these Greeks, because Jesus hasn't excluded the Gentiles in his ministry. Well, we've seen the Samaritans already in John. We know from the other gospel accounts he goes to other places, ministers to the Gentiles. But the priority of his ministry is the Jews. It's the covenant people of God. That priority at some point is going to shift to the Gentiles, but not until after he dies and then is raised from the dead and ascends to heaven, because that's when the curtain gets torn in two. And when that happens, all the structures and the systems of Judaism are made obsolete by his death and resurrection. And that's when the Gentiles are going to be brought in. When all of those structures from Judaism now are obsolete because of what Jesus does, now the Gentiles are going to have free, open access to him. It's the disciples then who are going to take that message to the Gentiles, and it's going to spread like wildfire. That day is coming when the focus will turn to the Gentiles, but that day is not yet, because Jesus hasn't died yet. So it's kind of like, I don't know if he literally puts them off, but you get that sense from the way John says it is not yet. Not yet for the Gentiles, because the death and resurrection has to happen first. And then, well, what does he say in verse 24, this image of his hour.
He used an example of a grain of wheat, which we know that the seed that you plant in a garden, that part of the seed, that dry part has to die so that little sprout can come out of it. And isn't that what this is talking about?
Yep,
If it dies, then it bears fruit, and that happens to every single seed that goes into
that's
the
right.
ground.
And then how many more seeds do you get out of that? That's right. And how many more plants? And yeah, if you take a seed and you keep it in your pantry, nothing happens, right? It just sits there. And Jesus compares himself to that. You know, if he preserves his life, well, his life stays one life. But if he dies, just like a seed that gets buried in the ground, he gives up his life, but whole lots of other people get life because of that. I mean, his life gets multiplied infinitely if he is willing to die. And that's also to the glory of God. When the Son of Man is glorified at the crucifixion, because we know the bigger picture, we know that he's dying in order for us to live. That life is going to come out of that death in ways that people who are listening can't even, I think, begin to understand yet. But he's willing to give up his life in order for other people to live. And then he takes that and turns it around to apply it to his followers. So what does he say in 25 and 26?
He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life.
Okay, let's talk about that. What does he mean by loving and hating your life?
If you love this world more than you love me, it's like, I'm living the dream. I don't want to give this up. Maybe later, I was thinking as you said that, and I don't know if this works, but I was thinking about how you mentioned the seed staying in the packet, and sometimes, people that have had, you see the opportunities, and they just keep to the point that you can take a seed that's been in a packet for 10 years, and it probably won't do any good to plant it in the ground at that point, because it's lost its life.
Yeah.
It's bigger.
Well, and just following on from what you said, what are the ways that the people of the world, even that we ourselves are tempted to keep ourselves in the packet? What do we mean by that?
Keeping ourselves in the past, we don't want to give our past up to follow Jesus, to follow him to his promise of eternal life.
I'm comfortable and warm in this little packet, so don't ask me to do something that might make me not be so comfortable. The ground's probably hard and cold.
It's trying to preserve your life for yourself,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I take it to be, is the being filled with the self, that selfishness, and holding on to your sins and all your comforts, your, questing after possessions, all the things that he says to let go of in life, and to not care about materialism, and to really be selfless and filled with the Spirit as you seek to serve him and others.
Yeah. Loving your life is keeping hold of what you have for yourself, right? Just not, you want to keep control, you want to keep your stuff, you want to keep your priorities, and you want to do what you want to do, and you want to keep your money for yourself. It's all about preserving this life that you have right now for yourself. And Jesus says, if you do that, ironically, you're going to lose it. If the harder you work at keeping hold of your life for yourself, the more guaranteed you are to lose it. But if you're willing to let go of it, if you're willing, and it feels risky, it feels like a death, doesn't it? When you start pouring yourself out for God, when you start putting his priorities ahead of your own, when you choose obedience to him over things that you think would be in your best self-interest, it feels like a death. Well, that's why in other places he says, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. But if you're willing to do that, to let go of your control of your life and your priorities and you setting the agenda, then he says you will keep your life for how long? Forever. That's where you get eternal life, is being willing to hand this life over to God and say you own it now, and what you get in return is eternal life. Whatever you lose in this life, you're going to get it back in spades on the other side of the grave, because you get eternal life in return. Okay, and then what does he add in 26?
If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him.
Okay, that's very interesting. When Jesus says we have to follow him, well, he's kind of repeating what he just said. Where is it that he's going? He's going to the cross. How do we follow him to the cross? Well, for the disciples, this was it was a life and death decision for them. Like all of them are going to have to make a choice about whether they're willing to die for Jesus. For most of us, being a follower of Jesus is probably not going to lead to that kind of life and death decision, but it is this choice every day of whether we die to ourselves, whether we put down control of our life and live for the sake of Christ or not. And, if we're following him, that should be what we expect, that he's going to ask from us our whole life. And it sounds costly and risky, and it is, but what Jesus says is that where he is, where he ends up, his servant will end up too. Where is it that he's eventually going to end up?
The kingdom of heaven.
That's right, in the presence of his Father. And so, after Jesus dies and returns to the Father, he's going to be honored. And he says that's what's promised for us too. That whoever serves him and follows him, whatever that costs in this life, we too will end up where he is, which is with the Father, and we will be honored because we obey the way Jesus did. Yeah, surely. That's right. That's right.
Because we saw how she served the Lord all through her life, and surely, this is what God promises.
Yep.
She's going to be mine.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And she's with all her little children.
That's right. Yeah. All right, now, what does Jesus then say about himself in 27?
He says his soul is troubled.
So having said all of that, what he just said about a kernel of wheat dying and calling his followers to do the same, shouldn't give us the impression that Jesus is naive or nonchalant about the suffering that comes with that. He knows what's coming, and his soul is troubled. And we know from the other gospel accounts that in the Garden of Gethsemane, you see this even more clearly in that he actually asks the Father to save him from this hour. Because the pain and the horror of what's coming is very real to him. But at the same time, he knows what he's here for. And he says that in verse 27.
Yeah, he knows that his life is destined for that.
That's right. That's his whole reason for coming was this hour.
Ordained for that, yeah.
Yep. And at any point along the way, Jesus could snap his fingers and be done with this. Just walk away from this crucifixion and it's over. But even though it's horrible what's coming, this is why he's coming. He knows it. So he's not going to deliver himself from it. He's not going to ask the Father to deliver him from it either. What is it that he wants, according to verse 28?
Glorify the Father.
Yeah, he wants to glorify the Father. He wants this crucifixion to glorify the Father. And then what happens?
God confirms it.
Yeah, the Father speaks. His voice comes from heaven and speaks, and he says he has glorified his name and he will glorify it again, which I think is just the assurance that this crucifixion is indeed going to serve the glory of God. The cross is just it's the clearest display of God's love, the supreme revelation of his glory, of who he is. And God is going to be glorified through it. Now, John notes that there's a crowd there, and they heard it, and they didn't all understand it. So some of them think it thundered. Others think that an angel has spoken to him. Just like we saw there are different levels of seeing with blindness. Right here we see there are different levels of hearing. Even when this voice comes from heaven, not everybody hears it the same way. But the thing is, I I guess I would have thought that voice was for Jesus' benefit when it came. But what does he say in 30 to 33?
Said it's for them in verse 29.
Mm-hmm. It's for the benefit of those people who are standing there. So,
Verse 30, it says.
yeah. So both the Son and the Father are making it as clear as possible that the ministry of Jesus, including the crucifixion, is to the glory of God. And even for those who can't understand what the voice says, the fact that something supernatural happens just at this moment when Jesus is saying these things should make an impression on them. That God is fully in control of what's going on here, and that it will bring glory to him. Okay, now he mentions 3 things then that are going to happen. What are the 3 things he mentions in relation to the crucifixion?
The ruler of this world be cast out.
Mm-hmm. So there's one.
The judgment of this world.
So the judgment will come on the world. That's one. The ruler of the world will be cast out. That's 2. What's the other one? What happens when he's lifted up?
He draws people to himself.
Yeah, draws all people to himself when he's lifted up. Okay, so let's talk about this. So, first, judgment in the crucifixion, judgment will come on the world. Now we know that final judgment waits for a future time. It waits for the last day. But there is judgment involved in the events of the crucifixion, just not in the direction the people thought. So when Jesus gets tried and convicted and then executed, all of these people who are participating in this are going to look at that and assume they've passed judgment on Jesus. Done with that. And what Jesus says is there's a judgment going on, but it's the other way around. When they crucify the Messiah, they're actually bringing judgment on themselves because they are revealing the depth of their rebellion against God. Like what sin is there worse than killing the Messiah? And it's going to result in a judgment that they're not even thinking about. So at the moment, and you see the irony, we'll get to it in a few weeks, when Jesus is sitting there on trial, the irony that there are all of these religious leaders presuming to judge the judge of the world. And he lets it happen, but he warns them. You think you're about judging, you're about judgment here. You're judging me, but you should know there's a bigger judgment going on right here, and you're going to be responsible for the things that you're doing. So there's judgment coming, but it's not ultimately going to be on Jesus. It's going to be on sinners. It's going to be on the world. Second, the prince of the world will be driven out. Now, of course, Jesus is talking about Satan, but in what sense is he driven out? I mean, we know that the influence of Satan continues today, so with all the evil around us, what do you think Jesus means by this?
I keep thinking, and I don't know if it's correct, that death was esteemed that what looked like the crucifixion was Jesus' death.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't his death.
That's right.
Meaning his resurrection.
Yep.
And also how, just curtailing that, how, because this forgives sin, that this takes away and is the grace that lets us be without, that he can purify our sin by his blood, then is Satan and sin driven out because of his sacrifice. Like, he takes away the sin of the world, and Satan's always in sin. And that also takes out the death, the sting part, because then we can go on to eternal life.
And surely, I think that, and it's been mentioned already, I think, and as I was praying this morning, because I know they've got families that's not saved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of, surely is in heaven, but the testimonies that will come out, that her family that are present will hear of the hope, and they know the love that she had, and they'll see the love that's been showered on her and Jerry. And I just think that's where it's a celebration, because we know she's not lying there. Amen.
What's the worst that Satan can do to you? He can keep you in bondage to sin and then kill you. if Jesus breaks the bondage of sin and gives you life on the other side of the grave, then he has broken the power of Satan. It doesn't mean he's gotten rid of the influence of Satan, but he has dethroned him. The prince of this world is no longer on the throne because he's been dethroned when Jesus dies and is raised from the dead. And so you're right, like when you go to a Christian funeral, the hope that is there is a proclamation by believers that this is sad, but Satan doesn't own the world. Our God has broken the power of sin and death. And there's glory coming because of what Jesus has done on the cross. Again, it's going to look like when the Messiah gets crucified that Satan has had his day. It's going to look like he's fully in control when Jesus gets killed. And yet here's Jesus saying ahead of time, not only is the judgment not what you think it is, but the spiritual power at work here is not what you think it is either. It's going to look like Satan had victory. But actually, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy from Genesis 3 that says the serpent will strike his heel and he will crush his head. The crucifixion is the place where he crushes the head of the serpent. It'll look like victory, but it's actually defeat.
And Satan's power his time is limited.
Yes. Yeah. And then third, he says, when he's lifted up from the earth, he'll draw all people to himself. Now, we've heard Jesus use that phrase lifted up before. We know that means, well, and John tells us, he's referring to the way he's going to die on a cross. When he's crucified, he'll draw all people to himself. What does that mean? I mean, obviously, it doesn't mean all people are going to believe in him. What's he talking about?
This is the opening up to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
This is all the nations. People from all nations.
That's right.
Will be drawn to him.
That's right. You see how Jesus just brought it back around to the question that we started with the Greeks, when the Greeks showed up? They wanted to see Jesus and they wanted to talk to him, and Jesus didn't answer whatever, I don't know what they wanted to talk about, but here's Jesus coming back around to that and saying, at the point when he's lifted up, then the Jews and the Gentiles will come to him. The Gentiles will have access to him. Because he will be the means of salvation for both the Jews and the Gentiles without distinction. And then the Gentiles will be brought into the covenant people, and they'll be given free access to him. Okay, so all of that to say, the crucifixion of Jesus is going to look like this terrible tragedy. But Jesus is already telling the people ahead of time. It's the opposite of how it looks. It's going to look like humiliation and shame, but it's actually going to serve the glory of God. It's going to look like judgment on Jesus, but it's actually going to be judgment against his enemies. It's going to look like Satan has won, but actually he's been defeated. And when the Son of Man gets lifted up, you'd think everyone will abandon him. Well, a whole bunch of people are going to be like, I don't want that kind of Messiah, and they're going to walk away. But Jesus is actually, the whole world is going to come to that kind of Messiah. He's going to draw everyone to himself. There are just cosmic implications of the crucifixion that, well, you can't get a hold of, really, until you get to the book of Acts. But Jesus is already saying, and he's going to say it over and over and over, don't be deceived by how it looks on the surface. God is in control. This crucifixion has been in the plan all along, and it's going to accomplish a great salvation for God's people. Okay, now what does the crowd say?
And see how he who is called the Christ is supposed to remain forever, but the Son of Man must be lifted up. And they're saying, who is this Son of Man? We can't grasp him.
Yeah, so they're like, so the Son of Man can't be the Messiah because the Messiah is supposed to reign forever, so how does all of that work? I mean, you know, again, Jesus and the crowd are talking past each other right here because they don't know yet that the Son of Man is going to be able to walk out of his own grave. And so they're just missing so much of what Jesus is saying, which is understandable because you can't really get it till you know what's coming with the resurrection. But how does Jesus answer them?
The light is among you for a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you.
Why do you think he says that instead of just stopping and explaining it all to them? I mean, he doesn't answer their question again. He doesn't explain, well, this is how it's possible and this is how he's going to die, but he's going to reign forever. He could have stopped and explained all that, but he doesn't. He just says, walk in the light while you have it.
That when we hear the words of light, we can respond, or we can choose to remain in darkness.
And that choice is ultimately a choice about humility and pride, not about the extent to which you understand everything that's being said. So what I mean by that is, you know that there are the disciples are there and there are other people there who don't fully understand what Jesus is talking about in all of these things. But they are committed to Jesus, even if they don't fully understand. They believe that he's the guy and they've put their faith in him, even though they haven't comprehended everything there is yet. But that's different from looking at Jesus and saying, I don't get it, this is ridiculous, and I'm out of here, which we've seen people do over and over and over in John. Walking in the light doesn't mean you have all the answers. Walking in the light means that you trust the one who is the light of the world. And that's what Jesus is doing. I don't think that he can adequately explain to everybody what's about to happen in the crucifixion and the resurrection. But what he calls them to do is to trust him, to believe in him, and to believe while he's there, standing there talking to them, because he says, you're not going to have the light much longer. And when he says, not much longer, we're talking about a couple of days. And then he's going to be dead. So this is the last chance they get. Not the last chance in the sense that you can't understand after he's been crucified, but there's not going to be a whole lot more teaching after this. He's been doing all this ministry all this time, and here's Jesus saying, put your stubbornness aside and believe in the light that you have while you have it. And if you do that, then when the darkness comes, it won't overtake you. It won't engulf you. It's going to be hard for the disciples to walk through that darkness when Jesus dies. But there is light in the middle of that because they've put their faith in the Messiah, even if they don't fully comprehend how all of these events are going to turn out. And he says, believe in the light while you have the light so that you may become sons of light or children of light. What kind of idea does that give you, being a son of light, being a child of light?
I'm a child, I'm going to reflect some of the qualities that a light has. I'm going to inherit certain traits and characteristics and probably pattern certain habits.
It's almost like you're becoming light yourself.
Maybe.
I mean, not in the sense that, we take the place of Jesus, I don't mean that. But I mean that in the sense that the light transforms us. And now it's not just that we carry the light around, it's that we become part of the light. And now we shine the light as well.
Isn't that happens when we read one, right? Rebirth.
That's right, yep.
The light.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I love how the qualities of light are, nourishment, warmth. I'm always reminded of that, and how the resurrection follows the actual birth of the sun again, and rebirth and springtime. Lent actually comes from the Old English word, which means to lengthen. So like the days in spring lengthen, and so there is this springtime of Lent, and then how you have his resurrection and the glorious lightness of that, and then the sun comes back for the summer. There's nothing coincidental about it, and how like even the very cycles of death and from winter like follow the rebirth of spring and new life and this, I don't know, I love that. I love the light. This is my favorite, just to like the heat, the warmth it gives off. Like you can just be sustained again by that itself, and how he is the source. Like he is the source of light. He imagined the sun, and so he is the light. So we can get all that warmth, and those same qualities are transferable, they're transparent. They see through everything, how it penetrates through everything.
Yep, and if we become children of light, then when the light of the world is gone, he's not actually gone. Because now the light is shown through us. Yeah. And then when he's done, well, it's a really pointed way to end, to warn the people. Basically, you can only reject the light for so long before God will give you over to the darkness you prefer. So, Jesus doesn't say it, but every time I read this, I think he's just kind of saying, stop it. Stop doing that. Stop rejecting the light and accept it while it's here, because you don't want to be overtaken by the darkness, and that's what's coming if you don't believe. And then, when he's finished speaking, he leaves and he hides himself from them, which I find really interesting. It's not just that the public ministry of Jesus is coming to a close, but when he withdraws, it's like he gives him a little taste of what's coming. If he chooses to hide himself, now the light isn't there to teach you. Have you believed what you heard? Or have you rejected it? And we'll look more at that next time. Okay. Comments? Anything you want to add? Anything that made an impression on you?
So just to keep going with the light, I just had this epiphany.
Epiphanies are good. Yeah.
It's not that. But, so this idea of light really, really speaks to me in that, in our new world, and how this applies and is relevant to us today, and that, the true light is in all of the outdoors, the real world, and how much of the modern world is like a superficial light of screens and being indoors. And true, you have to work and be indoors, and of course I'm not saying that light bulbs are bad or anything, but I really see that he asks us to dwell a lot in the light, and in the outdoors and with the sun. And I think that that's just a great direction to always have for us followers and believers, is to not just stay in these dark places of screens and technology and what we would close down, but just to be out and in the light.
It's interesting, isn't it, how much of creation has been designed in ways that give us physical illustrations of spiritual realities. There's just so much in creation that will constantly take you from this physical thing you see to a spiritual reality to apply it to. Yeah, and the light and the darkness is a great one.
And I love word pictures, obviously, but it's like, the longer you stay inside and out of the light, the harder it is on you when you go out. Light is bright, and that can really overwhelm you. I keep thinking of a mole. It's like, and that can be us.
Yep.
How little it takes, at least for me, if I've been brown and grouchy or itchy and worse, just to walk around the block. I don't have to go for a big, long 2-hour walk or something. I just have to get even in the yard maybe,
Yeah.
or on the front porch in the sunlight, and your whole perspective changes. And I didn't do anything. You didn't really do anything to do that. You just went out in God's world, and it's all different than the world. Everything that comes down on our heads in the world.
And it's magnified when you bump into somebody that shares the light, and you can even look at a little flower coming up, and somebody coming up in the flower bed. Now, talking last night about the seeds
Or tulips. Yeah, or daffodils.
and we can help each other in that.
And how it's everywhere. It's omniscient. Where is there that you can look that there is not light? and how much greater it is than the darkness. Like how, how it reveals the darkness, how it reveals everything. Like anything. Like you cannot hide from it. You cannot hide from the light.
So much of that just seems so relevant when we're coming up to Easter, doesn't it? Just that idea of the sun coming up on Easter morning and thinking, the darkness is over in more ways than one. All right, any last comments?